I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. The first thing I noticed wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see. For nearly 12 years, every time I pulled into that driveway, a wall of old cedar and maple trees greeted me along the back edge of my property. They weren't remarkable trees. They weren't famous. Nobody was taking pictures of them. But they were mine, and after enough years, certain things become part of the rhythm of your life. That evening, the rhythm was gone. I remember shutting off the engine and just sitting there for a second. The sky was glowing orange over the western hills, the kind of sunset people put on postcards, yet something felt strangely exposed. Like somebody had opened the curtains in a room that was supposed to stay private. At first, I thought maybe a storm had come through while I was at work. Then I walked toward the back fence, and that's when my stomach dropped. The trees weren't damaged. They were cut. Cleanly. Professionally. Deliberately. Entire sections of branches had been removed from only one side of the tree line. Fresh sap glistened in the evening light. The cuts were so smooth, they almost looked artificial. Whoever did it knew exactly where to cut and exactly where to stop. The downhill side, facing my property, was untouched. The uphill side, facing the luxury homes above me, had been stripped nearly bare. I stood there staring for a long time. Because once you realize somebody crossed onto your property and altered it without permission, your brain does this strange thing where it keeps trying to invent innocent explanations. Maybe they got the property line wrong. Maybe a contractor made a mistake. Maybe. But the longer I looked, the harder those maybes became to believe. Above my land sat a development called Hawthorne Summit. It wasn't there when I bought my place. The developers arrived about 7 years earlier and transformed an entire hillside into what looked like a luxury resort disguised as a neighborhood. Massive houses, infinity pools, glass balconies, outdoor kitchens bigger than some apartments I'd lived in. And from up there, the view was incredible, or at least it was supposed to be. My trees happened to stand between several of those houses and the valley below. I remember laughing once when a realtor described the area as having unobstructed panoramic views. Not from every property, I thought. Apparently, somebody else had been thinking about that too. I went inside and pulled up my security cameras. Nothing fancy, just a few cameras covering the driveway, backyard, and rear access trail. The footage from that morning answered every question I had. At 10:17 a.m., a plain white utility truck rolled in through the back access path. Not the front entrance. Not the driveway. The back. 2 men stepped out wearing safety vests and hard hats. They carried chainsaws and moved with the confidence of people who had done this before. No hositashchen. No knocking. No attempt to contact me. They simply walked onto my property and started cutting. What bothered me most wasn't that they were there. It was how comfortable they looked. Like they weren't worried about being questioned. Like somebody had already assured them there wouldn't be consequences. I spent nearly an hour reviewing footage frame by frame. Eventually, I managed to capture a partial license plate. Not perfect, but enough. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel worse. Because finding evidence meant accepting what had actually happened. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody wanted those trees gone. And for reasons I couldn't yet explain, they believed they had every right to make that decision for me. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I walked back outside and stood near the damaged tree line. The wind moved through the remaining branches, making a sound I wasn't used to hearing. The trees had always blocked most of the hillside above. Now I could see straight up to Hawthorne Summit, and that's when I noticed the tiny red lights. One, then another, then another. Little glowing dots scattered across the ridge. Security cameras, dozens of them, and every single one seemed to be pointed downhill, toward my property, toward my house, toward me. Standing there in the darkness, staring back at those blinking red lights, I felt something shift inside me. Because suddenly this wasn't about trees anymore. It was about something much bigger. And the next morning, I decided I was going to drive up that hill and get some answers. The next morning, I grabbed the plate number, threw a folder into the passenger seat, and drove straight up to Hawthorne Summit. Now, I've spent most of my life around people with money. Good people, bad people, normal people. Money itself doesn't bother me. But there are certain neighborhoods where you can almost feel the rules changing the moment you enter. Hawthorne Summit was one of those places. The entrance looked more like a private resort than a residential community. Stone columns, iron gates, security cameras tucked into every corner. Everything polished, everything controlled. I pressed the call button and waited. A woman answered. "Good morning, Hawthorne Summit." I gave my name and asked to speak with whoever managed the homeowners association. There was a brief pause. Then the gate opened. The climb up the hill only reinforced what I already suspected. Every lawn looked identical. Every flower bed looked professionally maintained. Every mailbox stood at exactly the same height. It was the kind of place where individuality existed only after it had been approved by a committee. The HOA office sat near the highest point of the development. Large glass windows, perfect landscaping, a framed panoramic photograph of the valley hanging in the lobby. That photograph caught my attention immediately, because the view in the picture looked suspiciously similar to the view my trees had been blocking. A receptionist greeted me with a smile that felt rehearsed. A few minutes later, a man stepped out from a hallway and introduced himself. Gregory Vance. He was probably in his late 50s. Expensive watch, perfect posture, the kind of calm confidence that comes from spending years making decisions other people have to live with. We shook hands. He invited me into his office. For a few moments, we exchanged polite conversation. Then I got right to it. Yesterday morning, somebody entered my property and cut part of my tree line. His expression barely changed. Not surprise, not confusion, nothing. Just a slight narrowing of the eyes. I see. I leaned forward. Security footage shows professional contractors. They entered through the rear access trail. I'd like to know who authorized that. The silence that followed told me more than any answer could have. Finally, he folded his hands together. There have been ongoing concerns from several residents regarding vegetation growth near the southern ridge. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. Those trees are on my property. Another pause. Our understanding, he said carefully, was that some growth may have extended beyond reasonable limits. Reasonable according to who? That landed harder than he expected. For the first time, his confidence cracked slightly. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the important part happened near the end. He never denied it. Not once. He never said the HOA wasn't involved. He never claimed ignorance. Instead, he offered compensation. Compensation. Like somebody backing into your car and immediately asking what it'll cost before admitting they hit it. That told me everything. When I left his office, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is messy. What I felt was clarity. Because now I knew this wasn't an accident. This was a calculated decision made by people who thought writing a check would erase the problem. When I got home, I started pulling records. Property surveys, boundary maps, county documents, everything. I spent most of the evening at my kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. My dog, Murphy, lay nearby watching me like he was concerned I'd finally lost my mind. Around midnight, I found exactly what I was looking for. The property lines were crystal clear. No overlap, no ambiguity, no legal gray area. Those trees were entirely mine. Every branch, every trunk, every inch, which meant somebody had knowingly crossed on a private property and altered it. The more I thought about it, though, the more my attention kept returning to the cameras. The trees bothered me. The cameras disturbed me. The following afternoon, I walked the entire perimeter of my property, carrying binoculars. At first glance, the cameras looked innocent enough. Security systems, motion detectors, normal suburban equipment. But once I started examining the angles, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One camera overlooked my backyard. Another pointed directly toward my workshop. A third appeared to have a clear view of the side of my house. And one in particular, made me stop walking. Mounted high on the corner of a home near the ridge. Zoom lens, direct line toward my bedroom windows. I stood there staring at it for a long moment. Then I did something I rarely do. I trusted my gut. My father used to tell me something when I was young. If something feels wrong, don't ignore it just because nobody else sees it yet. Standing there beneath that camera, I heard his voice as clearly as if he were beside me. That evening, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a surveyor named Hank Delaney. Old school guy, blunt, accurate. The second was to a real estate attorney named Rebecca Collins, the kind of lawyer who spoke quietly and terrified people anyway. The third call surprised even me. I called a contractor. At the time, I wasn't entirely sure why. I just knew I was done waiting for other people to decide how much privacy I deserved. 3 days later, Hank arrived with equipment that looked sophisticated enough to launch satellites. He spent nearly an entire weekend measuring boundaries, checking maps, confirming markers, double-checking everything. By Sunday afternoon, bright orange stakes marked every inch of my property line. Monday morning, Rebecca sent formal notices. Trespass, property damage, potential privacy violations. Every claim backed by documentation. Every statement supported by evidence. No threats, no emotional language. Just facts. The kind of facts that tend to make powerful people uncomfortable. And then Tuesday arrived. Just after sunrise, 2 large trucks pulled into my driveway. The crews unloaded steel posts, equipment, and stacks of dark metal panels. One of the workers approached me while I stood there holding a cup of coffee. "You still want this built exactly along the survey line?" I looked toward the hillside, toward the luxury homes, toward the cameras, toward everything that had started this mess. Then I looked back at the stakes. Exactly along the line. The worker nodded. "All right." He climbed back into the equipment. Moments later, the first post disappeared into the ground. And as the sound of machinery echoed across the valley, I noticed movement on the ridge above. People stepping onto balconies. People pointing. People watching. For the first time since someone cut my trees, they looked nervous. And the funny thing was, they still had absolutely no idea what I was building. By lunchtime, whatever curiosity existed up on the ridge had officially turned into panic. You could almost feel it. The workers kept moving with the same steady rhythm, setting posts, securing panels, checking measurements. They didn't care about neighborhood politics. They weren't invested in HOA drama. To them, it was just another construction project. To everyone watching from Hawthorne Summit, though it was something else entirely, it was a loss of control. Around noon, my phone started ringing. I already knew who it was before I looked at the screen. Gregory Vance. I let it ring twice. Then 3 times. Finally, I answered. "Hello." His voice came through calm, but not nearly as calm as it had been during our meeting. "Mr. Bennett, we need to discuss what's happening on your property." I glanced toward the construction crew. "What part?" "The structure being erected along the boundary." I took a sip of coffee. "Oh, that." A long pause followed. "Several residents have expressed concern." I couldn't help smiling. Concern. That was an interesting choice of words. Concern about what? The scale of the project. "You mean the project happening on my land?" Another pause. This type of installation could negatively impact the community. There it was. The real concern. Not property values. Not aesthetics. Not neighborhood harmony. The view. The same view they'd helped themselves to by cutting my trees. I looked toward the ridge where several homeowners were standing on balconies pretending not to watch. Then I said something that made the silence on the other end stretch for several seconds. "You know what negatively impacted me, Gregory? Finding strangers cutting my trees while I was at work. That landed exactly where I wanted it to." He tried steering the conversation back toward compromise, back toward discussion, back toward solutions. But the truth was we were way past that stage. They'd already made their decision when they stepped onto my property. I was simply responding to it. The fence went up fast. Much faster than people expected. By late afternoon, the shape was impossible to miss. 8 feet tall, solid steel. No gaps, no decorativo openings, no visibility. Just a clean, uninterrupted barrier stretching across the entire rear property line. When the final panel locked into place, the effect was immediate. The valley disappeared. The ridge disappeared. The cameras disappeared. Everything disappeared. For the first time since I'd purchased the property, there was complete separation between my land and theirs. I stood there after the workers left, listening to the wind move through the remaining trees. The silence felt different, heavier somehow, but peaceful, really peaceful. That evening, I sat on my back porch with Murphy lying beside me. The sun was setting somewhere beyond the steel wall. I couldn't see it anymore. And strangely enough, I didn't care, because what I'd gained felt more valuable than what I'd lost. Privacy, control, peace. Three things I hadn't realized were slowly being taken from me. The next morning brought a surprise. A truck pulled in my driveway around 9. Not a contractor's truck, not a lawyer's vehicle. An official landscaping company. Large logo. Professional crew. Uniforms. Everything legitimate. One of the workers approached carrying a folder. "Mr. Bennett, that's me. We've been hired to begin restoration work along your tree line." I blinked. "By who?" The worker glanced at the paperwork. "Hawthorne Summit Homeowners Association." Well, that was unexpected. I spent several minutes reviewing the documents. Replacement trees. Native species. Privacy screening vegetation. Maintenance guarantees. Long-term care contracts. The package was expensive. Very expensive. And every dollar would be paid by the HOA. Apparently somebody's attorney had finally explained what a property damage lawsuit might look like. The work began immediately. Over the next several days, dozens of new trees were planted. Fast-growing privacy species. Dense screening vegetation. Layered landscaping designed specifically to restore what had been removed. And then something else happened. The cameras started moving. One by one. Slowly. Quietly. Without announcements. Without public meetings. Without explanations. Angles changed. Positions shifted. Several cameras disappeared entirely. Others were redirected toward streets and driveways where security cameras normally belong. Funny how quickly people discover proper camera placement when lawyers get involved. By Friday afternoon, the transformation was obvious. The fence remained. The new trees were in place. The cameras were gone. And for the first time since this entire mess began, nobody seemed interested in looking at my property anymore. Saturday morning, I found an envelope attached to my front gate. No stump, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. Inside was a letter. It wasn't a confession. People like Gregory rarely write confessions. It wasn't an admission of guilt either. Lawyers tend to prevent that. But it was close enough. An apology. Carefully worded. Professionally drafted. Acknowledging mistakes. Acknowledging misunderstandings. Acknowledging that certain actions should not have occurred. I read it twice, then folded it and slipped it back into the envelope. Standing there at the gate, I looked across the property. The young trees swayed gently in the breeze. The steel fence stood behind them. Strong, permanent, unmovable. And for the first time in weeks, I felt completely relaxed. Not because I had won. Winning wasn't really the point. The point was reminding people that boundaries matter, especially when they belong to someone else. Now here's where the story gets interesting. Because not everyone agrees with what I did. Some of my friends thought the fence was justified. Others thought it was excessive. A few said I should have accepted the compensation immediately and moved on. One neighbor told me I turned a solvable dispute into a permanent feud. Maybe he's right. Maybe I could have handled it differently. Maybe if I'd sat down with everyone involved, things would have ended with a handshake instead of 8 feet of steel. Or maybe not. Maybe people who feel entitled enough to cut your trees without permission don't suddenly become respectful because you ask nicely. I honestly don't know. What I do know is this. Nobody has touched a single branch on my property since. Nobody points cameras into my backyard. Nobody talks about shared vegetation anymore. And every night when I step outside, I sleep just fine. But I'm curious what you think. If someone entered your property, cut your trees, and treated your privacy like it was negotiable, would you have built that fence? Or did I go too far? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely want to hear both sides of this one. And if you enjoy stories about property disputes, difficult neighbors, HOA power struggles, and those gray areas where right and wrong aren't always as obvious as people think, make sure you subscribe and stick around. Because sometimes the most important lines in life aren't the ones painted on a map. They're the ones people assume they can cross.